Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so how, politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name is Lee Battle and I'm a minister in the United Reformed Church, where I serve in Cardiff in an ecumenical setting. Each week, I am joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. And this week, I am so pleased to introduce to you Holly Adams. Holly is the Evangelism and Contemporary Culture Officer for the Methodist Church. This is a role which brings together her passion for equipping local churches for inclusive evangelism, and her passion for helping Christians speak relevantly into contemporary spaces and issues. And Holly also serves on the leadership team of her local church in Canterbury, where she lives. So thank you so much, Holly, for joining us today.
No worries, thank you for having me.
That's okay. So politics in the pulpit, I wonder what that means for you. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself and whether or not you see yourself as a pulpit politician?
Thank you, Lee. Yes, so I suppose, you had the job of introducing me there with my horribly long job title, but my work really in the Methodist Church is all about equipping people for confident and authentic evangelism. So I bring that perspective definitely to my understanding of what politics in the pulpit is all about. I guess the contemporary culture bit of my job title talks about the way that our churches and our faith connects with and speaks into kind of current issues. That's sort of how I understand pulpit politics too, is the way that we can authentically and relevantly and with gospel prophetic hope speak into kind of current issues around power and authority and justice and relationships and all those wonderful things. I guess I do see myself as a pulpit politician. I preach in my local church, but it's quite an interesting context. It's quite divided politically, our church. I remember when the Brexit vote happened, I think a few of us assumed that we'd all be on the same sort of page politically, and we realised quite quickly that we had everyone from the Brexiteer to the Remainer in our church congregation and our church family. So it's quite an interesting context to be a pulpit politician in. My church is in a really poor part of Kent, and it's interesting to me that doesn't guarantee that people will feel the same or believe the same around or have the same ideals around economics or welfare or, even things like the refugee crisis, which feels right on our doorstep sometimes in Kent. We've got a real mixture of different kind of beliefs and ideals in our church, and I know that is a dilemma that will be familiar to a lot of pulpit politicians, sort of working out how to preach in a way that is authentic to who you are, but which also allows room for God to work in your own heart and amongst others without anyone feeling kind of defensive or attacked or anything like that. But I guess for me there's a big lesson about how, and it's not just about preaching, but about evangelism too, about how when we share the things that are important to us, recognizing that there are people in the room who might be entrenched in kind of opposite viewpoints, whether or not that's about something political or whether it's about something faith-based. I guess I believe that it's not so much about putting across an argument that sometimes might just root us more in our existing opinions and divide us even more from the others around us, but that actually the answer is always to meaningfully connect with others through relationship. So whether that's kind of vulnerably sharing of ourselves in the pulpit, or whether it's making space to listen properly to others, for them to share, making space for others to share vulnerably in evangelism. I think for me that's the connecting piece here, is how do we meaningfully make space for engaging with other people who are different to us, whether it's preaching or evangelism or whatever it is, and how does that allow God to do work within us and within others around us.
I think you pick up a really important point about how suddenly with Brexit, suddenly there was that divide, like really openly in lots of our congregations, whereas like you, I think many people had assumptions of which particular like side people would be on, and it really has entrenched us. And I think you pick up that really important point about sharing the vulnerability, and that in that is the pathway to connection.
Absolutely.
And without that, it stays in political arguments. Whereas I think if people understand your story, where you're coming from, how you reflect the Bible through that, how you understand the Bible through that, that can build a pathway to connection.
Absolutely.
And across some really difficult spaces.
I think that's challenging, isn't it? Sorry, because sometimes when you're in a pulpit or like preaching in a preaching capacity, it can feel very one way. So I think it's really important when you're preaching or when you're amongst others who might feel differently to you, to make space for some of that real conversation to happen. I guess that's
yeah, and it's a lot of pressure as well. It is a lot of pressure to stand up and preach something that's authentic to you in a space that's divided. That feels very, very vulnerable to start off with in the beginning, and how we then do that in such a way where you hope and pray it's not going to create more division, but you go in not actually knowing whether that's going to be the case. It's such a leap of faith at times.
It really is. Yeah.
So this week, our colleagues from JPIT have given us a little roundup of the things we might want to be aware of and keeping our eye on. And so for this week, Parliament is back in full session this week. And so they're out of the party season and back into Parliament. And so that will be interesting, given how tumultuous the last couple of weeks have been. We have the ongoing economic uncertainty. We have the ongoing war in Ukraine. There's been strikes in Kiev this morning. And church dates that might be relevant to us is it's Black History Month in October. It is Prisons Week on the 9th to the 15th of October. We have upcoming as well the Week of Prayer for World Peace, the Challenge Poverty Week in England and Wales, and on the 18th of October, it's Anti-Slavery Day. So with all this in mind, our metaphorical newspapers in one hand, let's open our Bibles. And so I wonder, Holly, if there was a particular passage or theme or question that's jumped out this week that you would like us to start with?
Well, I guess I spent a bit of time preparing for this, thinking about how to start with, this theme of how the things that go wrong in these texts, particularly the Jeremiah passage, but also the gospel passage for today, the things where the kind of bad news emerges from the corrupt or unjust or painful political landscape. So I think, I mean, they're fantastic passages to come at from a political point of view, because the kind of suffering, the struggle in both the Jeremiah passage and the gospel passage emerge from injustice and places where kind of people and politics are allowed to be corrupt, or power is corrupt in some way. So in the context of the Jeremiah passage, of course, that's a context of exile, of societal collapse, of generations and generations of struggle, and the prophet is speaking into that context with hope and promise. And in the parable from Luke's gospel today, it's a very clear picture of an unjust system where a woman who's crying out for justice is prevented again and again from receiving it by a corrupt leader, who has no relationship with God and no respect for his people. So I think it's a fab set of texts to think about from a political point of view, because there's this sort of landscape of corruption and injustice upon which these kind of human struggles are taking place.
And I think in the Jeremiah text, what really got my heart as I was preparing for this was how it's written from the perspective of the Lord. The days are surely coming, says the Lord. This is the longing of the Lord for all this corruption to finish, for the sense of, for them to come back and for them to know the Lord again. It feels this really, I dare say, it's so relatable, that you could hear yourself saying it, and yet it's the Lord saying it. And there's something really humbling about that. And like we've spoken about before, you know, bringing the vulnerability into it. I think you see some of the vulnerability of God in this passage, some of the yearning for the people.
Yeah, Lee, I think what you've hit on there is something about intimacy. It feels so intimate, doesn't it? The words that the Lord speaks in that Jeremiah passage feels like it's about an intimate knowing of God and God knowing us intimately. The way it says about the law is written on our heart, it's like a new kind of knowing of God that is really intimate and is really about relationship between God and us. And that feels in a way so beautifully private, but also that this kind of has these implications for the way that the whole political landscape will play out. I think for me that really is the key theme throughout these readings, is the importance of relationship to justice, and how actually what both Jesus in the parable and Jeremiah is saying in that passage. I'm doing a better job of me explaining it earlier, that relationship is more important than argument, you know, that when it comes to justice, when it comes to evangelism, when it comes to being human together, that what matters most is our relationship with God and our relationship with each other.
And I think there's a real sense, I don't know how you felt about it, but a real sense of weariness about how long this has gone on for, about how distant the relationship between the Lord and his people has, how distant that's become, how long it's gone on, and just this real weariness to start to make back a relationship that is not based on what's gone before, but based upon the ending of that, and how then we begin again after such division, such pain, such suffering. How then do we start from kind of ground zero, if you like, in building that relationship back with God, with each other, with justice? Because I think so much has happened over the last 6 months, well, the last few years really. Everything just feels so improbable. You're almost waiting to be surprised. There's no sense of stability. There's no sense of thinking, well, this will probably happen, because we can't trust in the same way, I don't think, as we've been able to as people in our country, in our relationships, because of the divisions. And I think there's something so beautiful and, like you say, intimate in this. This has been, surely now we can begin again.
I think you've hit on a few things there, Lee. Partly the connection between the three of the passages for this lectionary week about the theme of persistence, and how, you know, in the Jeremiah passage, like you say, weariness has been, they've been waiting for these promises to be fulfilled for so long. And also with the gospel reading, with the parable, you know, this woman who's been crying out for justice again and again and again. And also in the letter Paul addressed to Timothy about kind of how when we share the good news, it requires persistence of us as well, and patience, and this theme of waiting for God to fulfill the promises that God's promised us. But I think that for me is so much about hope and about living in a way that expects that to happen. And you talked a bit there about how after the years that we've had, now, it's very hard to live in that way. But I think that's kind of what we're called to do as Christians, is to live in a way that models hope. I always come back to this. One of my favourite Bible verses in the whole Bible is from Psalm 27. I believe I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. You know, that famous verse.
Yeah.
For me, that speaks deeply into what we've just been talking about, how God's goodness isn't just for some kind of far off eternity, but it's for here and now, and it requires us to live with hope in the Lord. Despite all the systems of injustice that we're struggling against, we believe that God will do work in our hearts and amongst our systems of power too, that we will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think also, as well as persistence, the one thing that leapt out to me was prayer. Was about really doubling down on our connection with God. And I think because the world has changed so much with the oncoming crisis of, well, we're in it, aren't we, with the cost of living, that it's really easy to become very active in response to that. I know lots and lots of churches and people who have, worked really, really hard to create warm welcome spaces of being, of being able to, feed people, give food, have community within the difficultness. That when you're that forward focused, and when there's so much, in a sense, to physically do, that the prayer thing often might come at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day. Lord, help me with my day. I've got so much to do. I think we're called here to go, actually, no, prayer is key in this. And so often people go, oh, I can't, certainly older people in the congregations that I've worked with, there's nothing I can do, there's nothing I can give. And you can pray. And that is the foundation of it.
Absolutely. I definitely agree that these readings are a reminder about kind of the importance of prayer and persistence of prayer, and how that is like the bedrock of our relationship with God. I also think, like you say, there is so much need at the moment, with the current climate, with the issues around offering warm spaces. There's so much practical need, and I think we can so easily fall into models where we are just providers, where the church provides warm spaces, provides food banks, but actually that does lead us into difficult power dynamics with people around us. We become places that people rely on. We become places of power. Our buildings become places of power because we've got stuff that other people need. That kind of really problematic power dynamic. And I think some of the texts today remind us, in the Jeremiah passage, I know Walter Brueggemann talks about how this new covenant is one of solidarity, where the separation between the people and God is finally overcome. And God identifies as their God, and people identify as God's people. And this is the kind of new knowing that this covenant is based on. And of course, we're called not only into solidarity with God, which I think is a lovely image. What does solidarity with God mean for us? But also solidarity, of course, with one another. And so how does the way that we preach on these texts, but also how does the way that we respond to the political crisis going on around us, prioritize not only prayer, but also relationship with others in a way that isn't about provision, but is about solidarity? How do we meet people's needs, as well as prioritizing actually getting to know people, forming meaningful connections with people? Because I think that is the essential context for justice and evangelism to take place. Like without the context of relationship, we find we're not really doing justice or evangelism. We're just plugging a gap, meeting a need, which is an important need to meet, but there's kind of a whole dimension beyond that, which God's saying, kind of calling us into relationship with people.
And I think people realise that with food banks, that absolutely, utterly necessary. But when, after you've set them up, you've done them, ultimately we're a sticking plaster. We're not managing to engage as energetically, this is only my experience, as energetically with the systems that have created the need for food banks. And I think we are really at risk of doing this again with the warm spaces. But it feels like it's happened so quickly that there's almost a very obvious response to this need. But you're right in doing that. Because of the speed of it, we're not engaging fully with other people's autonomy and the sense of what is it in this community that could be helpful? How can you take ownership? How can we collaborate? And I think that we're in that real situation again where we might end up falling into that because the need is so big, and it feels so hard to everybody. There is that sense, I think, with food banks, often there was a separation. If you didn't need to use one, that perhaps you couldn't quite understand it. Whereas we all understand, we are all affected by this. We will have various different experiences of it, but the cost of living rise, it is going to affect us all to various degrees, and we're all, in a sense, I think, in need with it.
I think you raised a really great point there about recognizing our own neediness. None of us are set apart from in different ways from need. We all have different needs, not least our need for God to be at work in our lives. But also, I think you made a point there about how do we empower others to kind of to recognize our own agency. So how do we come alongside people in solidarity rather than doing to people or providing for people? And I think that really is a theme in the Jeremiah text from today as well, because God writing God's law on people's hearts is a really empowering thing, rather than the law being contained in a super holy place on the Ark of the Covenant. The law is engraved on everybody's hearts, each and every person. And that's a really radical vision of kind of a world where political authority is the possession of everyone. And it's kind of, we have that intimately connected to each of us. So I think that's a really radical kind of vision of God, what God's law is. It's not something that privileged people have access to, and that God can be accessed by privileged people with the right knowledge and mediation, but actually all of us have access to God and to God's law in our hearts. I think that's so empowering as a model of what would that look like for the way that we do justice today. You recognize that each and every person, especially people with lived experience of poverty or vulnerability, have something so important to contribute to the way that we respond to these issues.
And to bring in Timothy to that, there is also within that the sense of God placing the law on our heart, but also this weariness of wanting change, that this is something new. But then back in Timothy, as we've heard several times over the last few weeks, Paul speaking about his suffering, there is this list at the end of always being sober, to endure suffering, to do the work of an evangelist, to carry your ministry out fully. And that acknowledges so much of our lived experience as Christians, as people, but also acknowledges that we all feel these things differently and at various different times, and that suffering is part of our life as much as hope is too. And for me, I was thinking about it and how I pray during times of suffering. Do I really allow myself to come alongside God and allow God alongside me in these times? Or do I just go, I've got a very practical way of doing this, and I think I need to do this and I need to do this, and that might end the suffering? And yet time after time we're taught that to sit in that suffering, I read somewhere this morning, to hang yourself on the cross, to hang yourself on a hanging Jesus, that afterwards comes peace, that afterwards comes this hope. And that's a really, I think, beautiful thing to hold on to, but it's got to come in prayer.
Completely agree. Prayer and relationship, and I keep banging on about it, but like in the times of struggle, you know, when we do come alongside others, whether it's our own struggle, other people's, whether it's, you know, brokenness and division, you know, when it feels uncomfortable, actually the thing, you know, that thing about the goodness of the Lord and the land of the living doesn't mean that none of that exists. It means that we recognize God is at work in the midst of all of that chaos, and that we recognize that God is at work in us as much as others, as much as our systems. And that, you know, that question at the end of the gospel, of the parable, when it says, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? And, you know, throughout the gospel, Jesus has said to people, you have faith, you know, your faith has made you well, whatever. Again and again, we've heard Jesus commend people for their faith in that gospel. So we know that the beginnings of the answer to that question are, yes, like there is faith, but we have to be prepared to find it in the really unexpected places. And I think, you know, partly, you know, you said it, you mentioned earlier, it's Prisons Week this week. How do we choose to see faith? How do we choose to recognize faith in the places that we might not even expect it, you know, rather than amongst our church leaders, amongst the outsiders, the unlovely, the unclean, the vulnerable, the people who we don't easily notice? People in prisons are so invisible to us so much of the time. How do we recognize the faith and the hope and the kind of wisdom that these people bring? I think that's so important to our pursuit of justice, and important to our evangelism as well. You know, Timothy, as you said in the letters, Timothy's second letter, it's not about berating people or disrespecting people. That call to evangelism is about coming alongside people, listening to them. Timothy talks about persistence and patience, not kind of yelling at people with a sandwich board, but persistence and patience is about relationship. You know, it's about really coming alongside people, and sometimes the people that you might least expect, and recognizing that God is with them, God is at work in their lives.
I'm a huge believer in that. Very often our kind of blueprint for our relationship with God is our relationship with other people, because we often understand and relate to God after understanding what relationships are with people. And I think there's that dynamic through all of these texts, that there's something very human about them, but also so much of the divine in it as well. And recognizing, and I think 2 Timothy does this well, that other people's faith is going to look drastically different to ours. We can't dictate what faith looks like for people. We can't dictate what faith is, because in the Luke chapter before it, you know, when they were talking about when will we see you, I'm already among you. And there's something really grounding about that, about how our expectations and our judgments, like going back about what we think we should be doing. We're making judgment calls to create spaces for people. But are we doing that ahead of listening? Are we doing that ahead of prayer? it's a really, for me, it's a really inspirational set of passages to double down on that sense of, this is about our relationship with God, our faith, our walks with God. Ultimately as well, create the connections around us and allow us to be vulnerable in it as God, you know, as Jesus was. Jesus, and in the Jeremiah passage, we see vulnerability, we see love in that vulnerability, and when that power dynamic is there with creating spaces, what's not there is vulnerability, and allowing people's vulnerability to come in, because we've already assessed what we think their vulnerabilities are. And
just a quick story to share, that we run a night shelter every year in my church, as many churches do, and that's of course one of those, in a way, problematic power dynamics, you know, people sleeping in the church because they've got nowhere else to sleep, and you know, happy needs to be offered, it's a need. But actually, you know, I found that I was really getting to know the guests of the night shelter, especially because I'm a street pastor as well, so I do work with the homeless in the city anyway. So I found myself kind of building this relationship with some of these guys who slept in the night shelter. And one day, one of them said to me, can I light a candle in the church? I've had a really tough time. And I know he wouldn't have asked me that if I hadn't have kind of spent time getting to know him. And I felt kind of like, of course, like, it's not my building to, you know, to, like, it's yours, it's your church as much as it's mine. But that's kind of a problematic thing, isn't it, about how church buildings are seen to be kind of owned by the Christians. Anyway, so we went into the church and he lit this candle, and he said, would you pray for me? And I prayed. I didn't know, you know, I felt so kind of privileged that I was that he was there and he wanted me to be with him. And honestly, we had such an incredible experience of the Holy Spirit in the space. It felt so tangible. And I think that really is an example to me of when justice work and when evangelism just are God's work amongst people, you know, when we put God first and relationship first, then it feels like something changes, something shifts. And I think both of the, you know, the passages we've talked about today really are calling us into that, calling us into both our evangelism and our justice work. How do we put relationship first, relationship with God and relationship with one another, and just see what God does with it, because it will be beautiful.
And we can experience some of that in our preaching as well. Like some weeks when you've written a sermon, you absolutely can tangibly feel that the Spirit has been in this, in, you know, in your fingers on the keyboard. The Spirit has done this. Yet other weeks it's not the same as that. And what creates that difference is often my time and my openness to allowing all of that to come in. It will be reliant upon prayer. How much of my daily devotions have I been doing makes a marked difference to how my week goes, and my approach to the week goes. In, am I going under my own steam here? Am I catching myself? And that's a really human thing to do. There's absolutely no judgment in that, because we all wake up late, have to get the kids to school, and before you know it, we're 3 hours into the day and we're just sitting down to speak our first words. It's absolutely just part of life. But it's about also acknowledging that sometimes to really sit and make that space makes our preaching and makes our living and our relationships transformational. So I think I think the really exciting texts, I think they usher in a real change from the last few weeks. They do usher in this sense of slowing down, of prayer, of understanding relationship with each other and with God.
Yes, same. I think there's this, huge, vast landscape in all of them of like corruption and injustice.
Yeah.
But actually the stories, as you said already, at their heart are about being human and being in relationship with God and what that means and what happens when we work with one another and work with God, and how justice and evangelism happen in that context. I think it's such a beautiful calling into trusting God.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Holly, for coming on and sharing your really beautiful wisdom and reflections with us. And thanks to the rest of you for joining us to ask whether or how we should preach politics in our pulpits this week. If you enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with your friends. We really do want to have an ongoing conversation with our listeners, a relationship about talking about how we do faith and politics. So do join in on Twitter at @pulpit_politics or using the hashtag Politics in the Pulpit. Or you can find us on our Facebook community, which you can access through the Joint Public Issues Team Facebook page and on their website, jointpublicissues.org.uk. And so the question I'm leaving you with this week: how is your prayer life? How is your relationship with God? Please do let us know your thoughts on that, either on Twitter or on Facebook again. And so let's go into both our politics and our pulpits with this blessing. May you be anointed with God's Spirit as you bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.